My father locked my 7-year-old son outside in a Category 4 hurricane because of a lie. I can still hear the echo of what he told the police. He said he yelled at my little boy to get out because he did not need a thief in his house. 3 hours later, the emergency room staff called me. 1 hour after that, my father strolled into the hospital waiting room. When he turned the corner and saw me sitting by the intensive care window, his confident stride faltered. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He backed away and stuttered, asking how I could possibly be there. Before I tell you how a wealthy family patriarch could leave his own flesh and blood out to die in a freezing storm, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please let me know in the comments below. If you have ever had to protect your peace from toxic family members, hit the like button and subscribe to hear how my military training turned this tragedy into the ultimate revenge. My name is Tessa. I am 32 years old and a former military intelligence officer. For the past 4 years, I have run a high-level private security consulting firm. My family thought I was stationed overseas on a contractor mission. They thought I was unreachable. They thought they could treat my son Leo however they wanted. Leo is a sweet and sensitive 7-year-old boy who suffers from mild asthma. Because of a last-minute security breach at a client's site in Washington, I had to leave Leo at my family estate in Maryland for the weekend. It was supposed to be safe. My father, Vernon, is a self-made real estate billionaire who prides himself on his flawless public image and the sterling reputation of our family name. The rain was lashing against the hospital windows like bullets when the doctor finally came out to speak with me. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of screaming sirens and rushing nurses, but everything went dead silent in my ears. The doctor looked exhausted. He told me that Leo was suffering from severe hypothermia and a critical asthma exacerbation. They had to put him on a ventilator to keep his airway open. His tiny body was shutting down after being battered by freezing winds and torrential rain for 3 straight hours. I stood outside his room, looking through the glass at my little boy. He looked so small, surrounded by all those machines. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping me anchored to the floor. In the military, they train you to compartmentalize trauma. You do not cry. You do not break down. You assess the threat and you neutralize it. As I stared at Leo fighting for every breath, my training kicked into overdrive. My grief instantly crystallized into a cold and calculating rage. I was no longer just a mother terrified for her child. I was a tactical operator assessing a war zone, and the enemy was about to walk right through those double doors. I heard his heavy leather shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor before I saw him. My father walked in flanked by his personal assistant. He wore a pristine tailored suit completely dry and untouched by the storm outside. He looked annoyed rather than concerned. He approached the nurse's station with his usual arrogant posture, demanding to speak with the doctor in charge. He thought he was just here to sign some papers and throw money at the problem before the local news caught wind of the incident. Then he turned his head and our eyes locked. The color completely drained from his face. The powerful billionaire who controlled local politicians and boardroom executives suddenly looked like a frightened child. His jaw dropped. He stumbled backward, bumping into a plastic waiting room chair. He gasped my name. His hands visibly trembled as he grabbed the back of the chair for support. He told me I was supposed to be in Dubai and asked how I got here so fast. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I closed the distance between us, with slow and deliberate steps, until I was standing mere inches from his face. I asked him why my son was outside in a hurricane. My voice was dangerously low and steady. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the patriarchal authority he had used to terrorize me during my entire childhood. He pointed a shaking finger toward the intensive care unit. He yelled that my boy is a menace, and his voice echoed down the hospital corridor. He claimed Leo stole an expensive watch from my brother-in-law, Preston. He said when my nephew Trey tried to stop him, Leo hit Trey in the face. My father said I know he does not tolerate thieves and liars in his home. He said he simply put him on the porch to teach him a lesson about respect and that it was not his fault the storm got worse. I stared at the man who gave me life. He was justifying attempted murder. He threw a child with asthma into a deadly storm over a stolen watch and a playground scuffle. But I knew Leo. Leo was terrified of his own shadow. He would never steal, and he certainly would never raise a hand to anyone, let alone my sister Monique and her bully of a son Trey. I told him that he locked the deadbolt. The police report said the deadbolt was locked from the inside. I told him he left his own grandson out there for 3 hours while the wind chill dropped below freezing. He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He said Leo is fine because kids are resilient. He told me I need to discipline my child before he ends up in juvenile detention. He said this is what happens when you raise a boy without a father. Every word he spoke was another nail in his coffin. He did not ask if Leo was breathing. He did not ask if Leo was going to survive the night. He only cared about shifting the blame and protecting his fragile ego. The nurses and doctors were staring at us, but I did not care. I memorized every detail of his face. I memorized the arrogant sneer on his lips and the absolute lack of remorse in his eyes. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an incoming message from my lead intelligence officer. I had ordered them to pull the security feeds from the estate the second I got the call from the hospital. I stepped back away from my father. I looked him up and down with utter disgust. I told him quietly that he just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. I said you think you are untouchable because of your bank account, and you think this is just a minor inconvenience. I promised him he would lose everything he holds dear by the time I am finished with him. He laughed a harsh grating sound and called me delusional. He turned around and walked out of the emergency room, leaving me alone with the steady beep of the ventilator. But as I watched him leave, I knew the war had just begun. I stood in the sterile hallway watching my father disappear down the corridor. The anger inside me was a living, breathing entity, but I forced it deep down into a cold, dark box. My son was fighting for his life and I could not afford losing control. I needed absolute clarity. Before I could even turn back to the window of the intensive care unit, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open again. Out stepped my older sister Monique and her husband Preston. Monique was dressed in a designer cashmere coat and expensive leather boots, looking like she had just stepped off a fashion runway, instead of walking into a hospital emergency ward. Preston walked slightly ahead of her. He was a tall white man with a slicked-back haircut and an undeniable air of arrogant entitlement. He always looked down on our family, even though my father practically bankrolled his entire lavish lifestyle. They marched toward me with synchronized expressions of calculated annoyance rather than any genuine concern for my child. Monique stopped a few feet away and crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. She did not ask how Leo was doing. She did not even glance toward the glass window where her young nephew was hooked up to a breathing machine. Instead, she immediately began complaining about how incredibly inconvenient this whole situation was for them. She said the hurricane had already ruined her evening dinner party plans, and now they had to drive all the way down here to deal with this unnecessary family drama. Preston stepped closer to me, intentionally trying to invade my personal space and use his height to intimidate me. He told me in a low, condescending tone that my son was completely out of control. He confidently claimed that my little boy had sneaked into his private study at the estate and tried to steal his vintage Rolex watch. He said that when his son Trey caught him in the act, Leo became violently aggressive. According to Preston, my small, 7-year-old asthmatic boy viciously attacked his much larger and stronger 9-year-old son. It was a poorly fabricated story, clearly designed to make them look like the victims. Preston told me that my father did the exact right thing by kicking Leo out into the freezing rain. He said Leo needed a harsh lesson in discipline and respect for authority. I stared at his smug face, observing every detail. I noticed there was not a single drop of rain on his expensive Italian shoes. They had comfortably waited out the worst of the storm in the mansion before coming here not out of family loyalty, but strictly for corporate damage control. Preston reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket with a theatrical slowness. He pulled out a crisp piece of paper and casually dropped it onto the small plastic hospital table next to me. It was a check made out to my name for $50,000. He told me to take the money and pay the medical bills and buy myself something nice. But he made it very clear that there was a strict condition attached to this money. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. He said I needed to keep my mouth entirely shut about the incident tonight. He instructed me not to talk to the police and absolutely not to cause a public scandal that could embarrass the prestigious family name. If I refused his generous offer, he promised to make my life a living hell in the court system. He smiled a cold corporate smile and maliciously brought up my military background. He said his high-priced lawyers would gladly argue that my overseas combat tours left me with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He threatened to call Child Protective Services first thing in the morning and formally claimed that I was an unstable and unfit mother. He sneered that no family court judge in the state would ever let a traumatized female veteran keep custody of a chronically sick child, especially when up against a wealthy and upstanding citizen like him. Monique nodded in agreement. She told me to be grateful and take the handout. My hands remained perfectly still at my sides. A normal civilian mother might have screamed or slapped his face. She might have torn the check into tiny pieces and thrown it at them. But I was not a normal mother or a helpless victim. I was a highly trained tactical intelligence officer. I looked down at the piece of paper resting on the table. It was not an insult to me. It was a goldmine of actionable intelligence. Preston was so arrogant and blinded by his own privilege that he handed me a direct link to his secretive personal finances. I slowly reached out and picked up the check by the very edge, making absolutely sure to preserve whatever fingerprints he had left on the paper. I examined the 9-digit routing number printed at the bottom corner. I memorized it instantly. This account was not from his domestic wealth management firm. It was from an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands that flagged in my analytical mind. I looked back up at Preston and gave him a blank, emotionless stare. I folded the check and slid it into my pocket without saying a single word to either of them. My silence unnerved them. Preston adjusted his tie, looking slightly uncomfortable that I had not burst into tears. Monique scoffed and turned around, grabbing his arm to lead him away. As they walked back toward the elevator, I knew they thought they had bought my silence and won the war. They had absolutely no idea that I had just secured the exact ammunition needed to systematically destroy their entire world. I waited until the elevator doors slid completely shut and the digital floor indicator began its descent. The sterile hospital corridor was quiet again, save for the rhythmic breathing of the ventilator in my son's room. I took one last look through the glass window, watching Leo's small chest rise and fall. I promised him silently that I would return. I turned on my heel and walked briskly toward the emergency exit stairwell. I needed absolute privacy and a secured line. The heavy metal door clamped shut behind me, cutting off the ambient hospital noise. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and bypassed the biometric lock. I dialed the direct number for my lead security analyst. His name was Jackson. He was a former cyber warfare specialist who had served under my command during my final tour. He answered on the first ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told Jackson to initiate a remote breach of my father's Maryland estate immediately. I instructed him to pull every single frame of security footage from the past 48 hours. I also pulled the folded check from my pocket and read off the offshore routing number Preston had foolishly handed me. I told Jackson to trace the account back to its absolute origin and map every transaction. Jackson typed rapidly on his end. He asked me what our rules of engagement were. I told him there were no rules of engagement anymore. I declared a scorched earth protocol. As I listened to the steady clicking of Jackson's mechanical keyboard, my mind began to dissect the sheer arrogance of my sister and her husband. In military strategy, the most fatal mistake a combatant can make is underestimating the enemy. Preston had just committed tactical suicide. He assumed I was a broken and traumatized veteran who could be easily bought off with a piece of paper. He relied on his inherent privilege as a wealthy white male to intimidate me into submission. He thought he held all the cards because he married the golden child of the family. Growing up in our affluent household, Monique was always treated like royalty. My father Vernon worshipped the ground she walked on. She was the beautiful and charismatic daughter who perfectly fit the mold of black excellence he wanted to project to his wealthy peers. Whenever Monique broke a rule or failed a class, my father would gladly throw money at the problem until it disappeared. I was the scapegoat. I was the one who joined the military because I wanted to earn my own way and escape the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of a home where love was entirely conditional. When Monique met Preston, my father was ecstatic. Preston came from a supposedly elite background, but behind closed doors, he was nothing more than an opportunistic parasite. He married my sister to gain access to my father's real estate empire. My father was so desperate for the validation of white corporate America that he practically handed Preston the keys to the kingdom. Preston and Monique had spent years convincing my father that I was unstable and unworthy. They systematically isolated me from the family fortune, not knowing that I was building my own empire in the shadows. They thought my security consulting firm was just a low-level guard agency. They had no idea I held government contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Their ignorance was my greatest weapon. Jackson broke the silence on the line. He reported that my father's estate used a top-tier commercial security system. It was expensive, but completely standard. Jackson said it would take him less than 3 minutes to bypass the firewall and gain full administrative control. I leaned against the cold concrete wall of the stairwell and closed my eyes. I pictured the layout of the massive house. I told Jackson to focus specifically on the cameras covering the exterior porch, the grand hallway, and Preston's private study. I knew Preston was meticulous and paranoid. If an altercation happened in his study, he would have definitely tried to scrub the footage to protect his own son. Preston was incredibly sloppy. He operated under the assumption that throwing money at a problem erased the digital footprint. He thought hitting delete on a security application permanently wiped a hard drive. But I knew that data never truly vanishes. It just sits in the dark, waiting for someone with the right tools to drag it back into the light. Jackson confirmed my suspicion almost immediately. He told me that someone had manually wiped the local hard drive roughly 4 hours ago. It was exactly around the time the storm picked up and my son was thrown out into the freezing rain. I asked Jackson if he could reconstruct the deleted packets. I could hear the smirk in his voice when he replied. He told me the local drive was just a mirror, and he was already pulling the uncompressed raw files directly from the cloud backup server that Preston did not even know existed. He said it would take a few moments to render the video files, but he could already see the thumbnail previews populating on his screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly even. The pieces were falling into place. My family had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies and entitlement. They had sacrificed my innocent child to protect their pristine image and cover up their own mistakes. They thought they had buried the truth in the middle of a hurricane. I told Jackson to send the video feed directly to my secure tablet as soon as it finished compiling. I hung up the phone and stared at the blank screen for a long moment. The cold concrete walls around me offered a strange kind of comforting silence. I was more than ready to see exactly what happened in that massive house of absolute horrors tonight. My tablet vibrated in the palm of my hand with a soft mechanical hum. The notification light flashed green, signaling that Jackson had successfully bypassed the firewall and compiled the raw video files. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted application. The hospital stairwell was completely silent, but the blood rushing through my ears sounded like a roaring ocean. I tapped the first video thumbnail. It was time-stamped exactly 4 hours ago. The high-definition camera feed showed the interior of Preston's private study at the estate. The room was illuminated only by the soft glow of a desk lamp and the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. I watched closely as the digital counter ticked forward second by second. Preston was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. He looked incredibly agitated, running his hands through his slicked-back hair. Monique was sitting at the massive mahogany desk. She had several thick stacks of legal documents spread out in front of her. Even without audio, the tension in the room was palpable. They were not casually waiting out the hurricane. They were executing a calculated financial maneuver under the cover of the chaos. I zoomed in on the documents. My military training had taught me how to read lips and analyze body language with absolute precision. Monique picked up a heavy gold fountain pen. She leaned over the papers and began meticulously copying something from a master sheet. She was forging our father's signature. I watched as she practiced the loops and sharp angles of Vernon's distinctive handwriting on a piece of scrap paper. Preston leaned over her shoulder, nodding in approval and pointing at specific clauses in the contract. They were transferring assets. They were legally stealing millions of dollars from the man who had blindly bankrolled their luxurious lifestyle for years. My father had always thought Preston was a brilliant businessman, but the camera proved he was nothing more than a common white-collar criminal using my sister to commit felony fraud. Just as Monique finished signing the bottom line of the final document, the heavy oak door of the study slowly creaked open. My breath hitched in my throat. Into the frame walked my 7-year-old son, Leo. He was wearing his oversized dinosaur pajamas and clutching his favorite stuffed bear. He looked tired and confused. He had probably woken up from the thunder and wandered out looking for me, forgetting that I was away on a security detail. Leo rubbed his eyes and stepped into the room. Preston and Monique froze in sheer panic. Preston aggressively snatched the forged documents off the desk and shoved them into a leather briefcase. Monique jumped up from the chair looking terrified that someone had caught them in the act. But Leo did not understand what they were doing. He was just a sleepy child looking for a safe place to hide from the storm. He took another step forward, asking them a question I could not hear. Before Preston or Monique could react, my nephew Trey pushed his way into the study. Trey was a large boy for his 9 years, built like a miniature version of his arrogant father. He had been lurking in the hallway and saw Leo interrupt his parents. Trey grabbed Leo by the shoulder and roughly shoved him backward. The force of the push knocked Leo off balance. My sweet boy stumbled and fell hard onto the hardwood floor, dropping his stuffed bear. My chest tightened with a white-hot fury. I watched my son gasp for air, clutching his chest as the impact triggered an immediate asthma response. Preston did not reach out to help him. Monique did not run to comfort her nephew. Instead, Preston looked down at Leo with utter disgust and pointed a demanding finger toward the hallway. He was telling Trey to get rid of him. Trey grabbed Leo by the arm and dragged him up from the floor. He pulled my struggling, coughing son down the long corridor toward the heavy glass doors leading to the back patio. The storm outside was raging with Category 4 winds and freezing rain. I watched helplessly through the screen as Trey opened the patio door and violently shoved Leo outside into the absolute darkness. Trey then slammed the heavy glass door shut and slid the metal deadbolt into place, locking his own little cousin in the freezing hurricane. Trey walked back into the study with a proud smirk on his face, looking for his parents' approval. Preston patted his son on the back like he had just won a baseball game. They quickly fabricated the lie right then and there. I watched Preston point at his own wrist, tapping his expensive watch. He was establishing the story that Leo was a thief. He was telling Monique and Trey exactly what to say to my father so they could cover their tracks and keep their massive financial fraud a total secret. Preston then walked over to the security panel on the wall. He typed in his administrative passcode and tapped the screen to delete the local hard drive footage. The screen went black. He thought he had erased his crimes forever. He thought he had successfully sacrificed my child to protect his stolen millions. I lowered the tablet, resting it against my knee. The cold concrete walls of the stairwell felt like a cage closing in around me. My heart beat with a slow, methodical rhythm. There was no sadness left inside me. There was only a devastating and surgical need for total destruction. They did not just neglect my son. They actively tried to eliminate him to protect a white-collar syndicate. I slipped the tablet back into my tactical jacket. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I took a deep breath and walked back into the hospital hallway, ready to initiate the complete annihilation of my corrupt family. I stepped out of the cold concrete stairwell and walked back into the brightly lit corridor of the intensive care unit. The storm had finally broken, leaving a calm, sunny Sunday morning. But inside the hospital, the sterile hum of medical machinery and the sharp smell of antiseptic remained a constant reminder of the nightmare my son was enduring. I stood by the glass window of Leo's room. His small chest rose and fell in a steady mechanical rhythm dictated by the ventilator. The pediatric nurses moved quietly around his bed, checking his vitals and adjusting intravenous drips. I placed my hand against the glass. A profound sense of clarity washed over me. The raw panic of almost losing my child evaporated, leaving a tactical precision I honed over years of military service. My encrypted phone vibrated. I pulled it out expecting Jackson, but the screen displayed a text message from my father. I opened it and read the words with a completely blank expression. Vernon wrote that he was officially banning me from the estate until I learned to respect his authority. He stated he would not allow my dramatic outbursts to ruin the traditional family Sunday dinner. He actually typed those words. My 7-year-old son was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life because of their cruelty, and my father was worried about his dinner party. He ended the text reminding me that the local mayor and several prominent developers were attending, demanding I stay away and keep quiet. In my family, the Sunday dinner was never a warm gathering. It was a calculated theatrical performance. Vernon used our sprawling dining room as a stage to flaunt his wealth and solidify his status among the elite of Maryland. I could picture the scene unfolding at the estate right at this moment. The mahogany table covered in expensive silver platters and crystal glasses. My mother directing the catering staff wearing her perfect dress and suffocating fake smile. Monique playing the role of the devoted mother and successful socialite. Preston pouring expensive wine for the mayor, pretending to be the brilliant heir to my father's empire. They would bow their heads thanking God for abundant blessings while actively ignoring they had nearly murdered an innocent child the night before. The sheer audacity of their disgusting hypocrisy made me want to burn their carefully constructed world to the ground. As I locked my phone screen, it immediately buzzed again in my hand. This time it was an incoming call from Jackson. I answered the secured line, pressing the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes fixed on my sleeping son. Jackson did not waste any precious time with greetings. His voice was tight with disbelief. He told me he finished running the trace on the offshore routing number from the check Preston handed me. Jackson had to bounce the tracking signal through 3 different global servers just to successfully bypass the heavy military-grade encryption on the hidden Cayman account. I asked him what he found. Jackson took a deep breath and laid out the financial blueprint of Preston's entire life. The account in the Cayman Islands was not just a secret stash for avoiding domestic taxes. It was the central hub for a massive international money laundering syndicate. Jackson explained that Preston had set up dozens of anonymous shell corporations across the globe. He was taking dirty money from an organized crime syndicate and washing it clean through my father's legitimate real estate development projects. That was the real reason Preston married Monique. He did not love my sister. He needed unlimited access to Vernon's portfolio of commercial properties to clean millions of dollars in illicit cash. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The forged documents I watched them sign on the security footage were not just a simple embezzlement scheme. Preston was transferring my father's most valuable assets directly into the hands of a dangerous criminal syndicate to cover his debts. He leveraged my father's entire empire without Vernon even knowing it. And my sister Monique was either too stupid to realize what she was facilitating or entirely complicit in the federal crime. They were playing a deadly game with ruthless people. When Leo accidentally stumbled into the study and interrupted their forgery, they panicked because their lives and freedom were genuinely on the line. I pulled the folded $50,000 check from my tactical jacket pocket and stared closely at the messy handwriting. Preston was so deeply entrenched in his corporate arrogance that he genuinely thought he was completely untouchable. He arrogantly assumed I was just a financially struggling single mother who would gladly take a bribe to keep quiet about a family dispute. Instead, he had casually handed a highly trained federal intelligence officer the direct routing number to a global money laundering operation. He had blindly given me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. Jackson asked if I wanted him to forward the financial dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him to prepare the files but hold off on sending them. I did not just want Preston to go to prison. I wanted to dismantle the false reality my family built. I wanted to strip away every ounce of their wealth, their status, and unearned pride. I wanted them to feel the exact cold terror my son felt when they locked him outside in the hurricane. I told Jackson to keep monitoring their accounts and stand by for my next order. I finally hung up the encrypted phone and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the hospital window. I softly whispered a solemn promise to Leo that I would definitely be back soon. I turned away from the intensive care unit and walked toward the hospital exit. They wanted to enjoy a peaceful Sunday. I was going to give them a Sunday they would never forget. The morning air was crisp and unseasonably warm as I pulled my black SUV into the parking lot of the elite community church. This was the most prestigious congregation in the county. It was a place where wealthy developers and socialites gathered every Sunday not to seek spiritual guidance, but to display their designer clothes. My father had donated millions to build the new fellowship hall, so the family practically owned the front pew. I parked next to Preston's expensive sports car. I turned off the engine and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I skipped my usual Sunday dress. I wore a tailored black tactical suit that projected absolute authority. I checked the encrypted tablet one last time. Jackson had successfully forwarded the preliminary financial dossier detailing Preston's money laundering operation. I locked the vehicle and walked toward the massive oak church doors. The choir was just finishing their opening hymn when I pushed the heavy doors open. The music echoed through the vaulted ceilings, but I tuned it all out. I scanned the crowded room and immediately spotted them. My father Vernon sat at the edge of the front row looking incredibly smug. My mother sat next to him fanning herself with a printed program. Monique and Preston were seated right behind them playing the perfect loving couple. Trey sat between them completely unbothered that he almost murdered his cousin last night. I walked slowly down the center aisle. My leather boots clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. Several members of the congregation turned their heads to stare at me. They whispered to each other, recognizing the outcast daughter who was supposedly deployed overseas. I stopped right at the end of their pew, blocking their path to the altar. Vernon looked up, and his confident smile instantly vanished. He aggressively whispered my name, demanding to know what I was doing here, disrupting the service. I completely ignored my father and locked eyes directly with Preston. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The sheer arrogance he displayed at the hospital was beginning to crack. He leaned forward and told me in a low voice that I needed to leave immediately. He said this was a house of worship, and I was embarrassing the family. I did not move a single inch. I told Preston that he was the last person on earth who should be talking about worship. I told him I knew exactly what he did in the study last night. I watched the blood drain from his face. His eyes darted nervously toward Monique and then back to me. Preston quickly realized he was losing control of the narrative. He decided to deploy his favorite defense mechanism. He weaponized his privilege. He stood up from the pew and raised his voice just loud enough for the surrounding church members to hear. He put on a face of exaggerated fear and concern. He loudly announced that I was having a severe mental breakdown. He told the congregation that my military service had left me dangerously unstable and that I was harassing his family. Monique immediately jumped up and grabbed his arm, playing the terrified wife. She cried out, telling me to please stop threatening her husband. The head usher rushed over, trying to de-escalate the situation. Preston turned to the usher and claimed that I was a traumatized veteran who was making violent threats against him and his young son. I stood my ground, looking at him with absolute disgust. He was a wealthy white man manipulating deep-seated societal fears of aggressive behavior to protect himself. He was using the very real stigma of post-traumatic stress disorder to paint me as a dangerous predator while he was the actual criminal. My father stood up and grabbed my arm roughly. He hissed under his breath that I was ruining his reputation and ordered me to walk away before he had me forcibly removed. I forcefully yanked my arm out of his grasp. I told my father he had absolutely no idea who he was protecting. I told him he was defending a parasite who was actively bleeding his entire empire dry. Preston pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket. He loudly declared that he had no other choice because he feared for his life and the safety of his family. He dialed emergency services right there in the middle of the sanctuary. I stood perfectly still and let him make the call. I listened as he lied to the police dispatcher. He used a trembling voice, claiming that an unstable military veteran was trespassing and threatening physical violence at a church. He gave them my name and told them I needed to be arrested and subjected to a mandatory psychiatric hold. The church service came to a complete halt. The pastor stood awkwardly at the pulpit, not knowing what to do. The whispers of the congregation turned into loud murmurs of shock and judgment. My mother covered her face with her hands, pretending to weep out of shame. Monique glared and silently mouthed that I would lose my son forever. Preston ended the phone call and crossed his arms, looking down at me with a victorious smirk. He whispered that the local police chief was a personal friend of his, and I was about to spend the night in a concrete cell. He thought he had successfully neutralized the threat. He thought his money and his status would shield him from any consequences. He did not realize that I wanted the police to arrive. I wanted everything to happen in a very public and highly documented space. I calmly straightened the collar of my tactical jacket and checked my watch. The police station was only 2 miles away. I told him his time as a free man was rapidly running out. I stood in the aisle surrounded by hostile stares and waited for the flashing lights to appear through the stained glass windows. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers flickered against the beautiful stained glass windows, casting an eerie and urgent glow over the silent congregation. 2 heavy-set uniformed police officers pushed through the massive oak doors of the sanctuary. Their hands rested aggressively on their utility belts as they quickly scanned the crowded room for the supposed violent threat. Before they could even speak or assess the situation, my mother launched into her award-winning theatrical performance. She burst into loud, exaggerated tears and rushed down the center aisle, placing herself directly between me and the approaching police officers. She grabbed my shoulders and dug her perfectly manicured nails deeply into the fabric of my black tactical jacket. She pleaded with me in a loud, dramatic whisper, begging me to just apologize to Preston and walk away. She told me I was ruining the black elite family image they had spent decades carefully building in this community. She reminded me that the local mayor and several wealthy investors were watching us right now from the surrounding pews. She said my stubborn pride was going to destroy everything my father had worked so hard to achieve. I looked directly into her eyes and saw absolutely no genuine sorrow for my hospitalized child. There were no real tears on her cheeks, and her breathing was perfectly calm. It was nothing but a desperate and calculated attempt at social damage control to protect her own fragile status. I gently but firmly removed my mother's hands from my shoulders and stepped past her without saying a word. The 2 police officers marched down the aisle and approached us with stern, hostile expressions. The older officer immediately recognized Preston, standing in the front pew. The officer relaxed his rigid posture and gave Preston a familiar, friendly nod indicating they were indeed golf buddies, just like Preston had arrogantly bragged at the hospital. Preston pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and told the officers that I was deeply disturbed and trespassing on private church property. He confidently claimed that I was having a violent psychiatric episode related to my military service and needed to be forcefully removed from the premises immediately. The older officer turned to me with a cold, condescending glare. He did not bother to ask for my side of the story. He did not care why a mother whose 7-year-old son was fighting for his life on a ventilator was standing in a church aisle, demanding answers. He simply reached for the handcuffs on his belt and told me to place my hands behind my back, or he would be forced to use physical restraints to subdue me. The entire congregation held its collective breath, eagerly anticipating the spectacle of the outcast daughter being publicly humiliated and dragged away in steel cuffs. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not raise my hands in surrender. I maintained an unwavering and icy eye contact with the older officer. I slowly and deliberately reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tactical jacket. The younger police officer instinctively dropped his hand to his holstered weapon, but I moved with careful, non-threatening precision. I pulled out a solid black leather credential case and flipped it open, holding it right in front of the older officer's face. The heavy gold brass seal caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. It was my federal identification classifying me as a senior intelligence consultant for the Department of Defense with the highest level of security clearance. I calmly informed the local officers that I was an active federal contractor, acting under the strict jurisdiction of national security protocols. I stated clearly that placing a single finger on me would result in an immediate and devastating federal investigation into their entire police precinct. The older officer's eyes widened dramatically as he read the federal credentials and scanned the barcode on my identification card. All the unearned authority and aggressive arrogance instantly drained from his posture. He swallowed hard, realizing he was standing in front of someone who severely outranked the local police chief he answered to every day. He took a very noticeable and clumsy step backward. He stammered a nervous apology, addressing me respectfully by my official military rank. He turned back to Preston, looking completely confused and visibly irritated that he had been dragged into this. The officer told Preston that this was clearly a civil family dispute, and there was absolutely no legal basis to make an arrest. Preston opened his mouth to loudly argue his case, but the older officer shook his head and quickly ushered his younger partner back down the aisle toward the exit. They practically ran out of the building, desperate to escape federal involvement. A profound and heavy silence fell over the massive sanctuary. The congregation watched in stunned disbelief as the local authorities completely retreated. My father stood frozen in the front pew, with his mouth hanging slightly open, unable to process what just happened. Monique abruptly stopped her fake crying and stared at me with genuine fear, replacing her calculated distress. They finally realized I was not the helpless, financially struggling daughter they thought they could easily bully and intimidate. Preston realized his public show of absolute force had failed miserably, and his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He could not stand being embarrassed in front of his wealthy peers, so he decided to rapidly change his tactics. Preston plastered a fake forgiving smile on his face for the watching crowd and slowly stepped into my personal space. He reached out and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, pretending to offer a genuine gesture of familial reconciliation to the congregation. But when he leaned close to my ear, his voice was dripping with absolute venom and malice. He whispered that I might have impressed his local police friends with my little government badge, but I was still completely powerless where it actually mattered. He cruelly reminded me that my father's massive real estate company controlled the premium family health insurance policy that was currently keeping my son alive in the intensive care unit. He softly threatened to make one simple phone call right after the church service ended to completely cut off all of Leo's medical funds. He sneered and promised me that the hospital billing department would pull the plug on my boy by sunset if I did not back down. He stepped back and loudly proclaimed for the silent congregation that he completely forgave my emotional outburst and prayed I found the mental help I so desperately needed. He truly thought his hidden financial threat would finally break my spirit and force me to surrender in tears. He had absolutely no idea how military intelligence operatives handle hostage situations. You do not negotiate with terrorists, and you never show them fear. I looked at Preston with a chilling emptiness in my eyes, holding his gaze until he looked away. I did not say another word to him or my parents. I simply turned around and walked back up the long center aisle of the church. My boots echoed sharply against the polished marble floor, marking the steady cadence of an approaching war. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped back out into the warm Sunday morning, completely prepared to execute the next phase of my operation. The drive back to the hospital was a blur of passing trees and gray asphalt. I kept my breathing perfectly steady and my hands firmly gripped on the cold leather steering wheel. Preston had made his threat loud and clear at the church, and I knew he was arrogant enough to follow through. He truly believed that controlling the purse strings gave him absolute power over life and death. I pulled into the hospital parking garage and made my way up to the pediatric intensive care unit. The sterile smell of the hospital hit me like a physical wall as I stepped off the elevator. I walked straight toward my son's room, but before I could reach the heavy glass doors, a woman in a sharp gray business suit intercepted me. She introduced herself as the head of the hospital billing and administration department. She had a thick manila folder clutched to her chest, and she looked deeply uncomfortable. She asked me to step into a small private consultation room down the hall. I knew exactly what was coming, but I followed her without a single word of protest. The administrator closed the door and offered me a sympathetic but professionally detached smile. She explained there was a sudden complication with the primary method of payment on file for my son's emergency medical care. She told me less than 20 minutes ago the primary account holder personally contacted the hospital billing department and initiated an immediate freeze on the family corporate credit card. Preston had executed his threat exactly as he promised. The administrator cleared her throat and nervously explained that because Leo was receiving top-tier specialized care in the intensive care unit, the daily costs were astronomical. She said hospital policy dictated that without a verified and active method of payment, they would be forced to begin transferring my 7-year-old son to a lower-level public county hospital within the next 12 hours. She apologized profusely and handed me a printed invoice that showed a staggering pending balance. Preston and my father were willing to risk my son's fragile life in transit, just to teach me a lesson in obedience. They thought they had backed me into a terrifying corner. They expected me to break down crying in this tiny room and beg them for financial mercy. They expected me to call my father and grovel for forgiveness so they would turn the credit card back on. I looked at the administrator and took the printed invoice from her trembling hands. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not panic. I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket, telling her I would handle the balance shortly. As I walked out of the billing office and headed back toward the intensive care unit, a tall man in an expensive navy blue suit stepped directly into my path. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore a smug, arrogant expression that perfectly mirrored the men in my family. I recognized him immediately. He was the senior partner at the prestigious law firm my father retained for all of his corporate and personal legal affairs. He did not bother asking how my son was doing. He simply unlatched his briefcase right there in the middle of the hospital corridor and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He handed the stack to me with a cold, calculating smile. He informed me that he had just come from an emergency Sunday morning meeting with my father, Vernon. He said my father was deeply distressed by my public behavior at the church and had decided to make immediate and permanent changes to the family trust and his last will and testament. The lawyer pointed to the second page of the document, highlighting a specific paragraph. He read it aloud, making sure his voice carried a tone of absolute finality. My father had officially entirely disinherited me. Vernon had completely legally severed my ties to the family real estate empire and the generational wealth he had spent decades building. The lawyer smirked and noted my father had left me exactly one single dollar. He explained that leaving me $1 was a specific legal tactic designed to prove that I had not been accidentally forgotten, but intentionally and maliciously cut out of the estate. It was the ultimate insult from a patriarch who demanded absolute submission. The lawyer handed me a customized, expensive pen and demanded that I sign the acknowledgement forms immediately. He confidently assumed I would be devastated by the loss of millions of dollars. He thought my entire sense of self-worth was tied to my father's bank accounts, just like my sister Monique. I looked down at the documents and then back up at the smug corporate lawyer. I took the pen and signed my name with smooth, perfect cursive. I handed the clipboard back to him and told him to give my father my regards. I told the lawyer that $1 was exactly what his client's entire empire was going to be worth by the end of the week. The lawyer scoffed at my warning, shook his head in amusement, and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I finally made it back to my son's room. Leo was still sedated, and the ventilator was breathing for him. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a high-priority alert from Jackson. He said Monique had just launched a coordinated digital attack. I opened the link Jackson had sent. Monique had posted a lengthy, emotionally manipulative video across all her social media platforms. She had over 500,000 followers who hung onto her every word, pretending she was the epitome of Black excellence. In the video, she was sitting in her lavish living room, wearing minimal makeup to look exhausted. She squeezed out fake tears and spoke directly to the camera, painting a horrifying and fabricated picture of the events from last night. She claimed I was a deeply disturbed veteran who suffered from violent psychotic breaks. She told her massive audience I had abandoned my son in a dangerous hurricane during a manic episode, and that her brave husband Preston had heroically tried to save him. She completely twisted the narrative, framing herself and Preston as the loving, concerned family trying to protect an innocent child from an unfit and dangerous mother. The comment section beneath her video was a vile cesspool of hatred. Thousands of strangers were demanding that Child Protective Services take my son away. I instructed Jackson to archive every single comment and download the video file directly to our secure servers. Every lie Monique told the camera was just another piece of digital evidence proving her direct complicity in the cover-up. My family had played all their best cards in a desperate attempt to crush me, but they were playing checkers while I was executing a military siege. I slowly put my tablet away and walked calmly back toward the billing department. It was time to show them exactly how a ghost operates in the financial shadows. I walked into the billing administration office and stood quietly waiting for the woman in the gray suit to look up from her computer screen. When she finally did, her expression was a mix of pity and professional impatience. She probably expected me to ask for a payment plan or beg for a few more hours before they transferred my son to the county facility. Instead, I reached into my tactical jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy matte black metal credit card. I placed it gently onto the center of her desk, right on top of the printed invoice she had given me earlier. The card bore no visible spending limit and was issued by a private banking institution that only serviced ultra-high net worth individuals. It was the physical manifestation of the immense hidden wealth I had spent the last 4 years building through high-level government security contracts. The administrator stared at the black card for a long moment. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting from the exclusive logo back up to my face. She picked it up with slightly trembling fingers as if it were made of glass. I did not break eye contact. I told her in a perfectly calm and even tone to clear the entire pending balance for my son's intensive care stay. I also instructed her to put a permanent hold on his account and authorize any future medical expenses without question. I told her my son was not moving anywhere, and he would receive the absolute best care this hospital could provide. The administrator quickly typed my information into her terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The transaction was approved instantaneously. She printed a receipt that showed a zero balance and handed it to me with a newfound profound respect. She assured me that Leo would remain comfortably in the pediatric intensive care unit for as long as he needed. I thanked her coldly and walked back out into the sterile hospital corridor. Preston and my father thought they had cut off my lifeline. They thought taking away the family credit card would leave me destitute and desperate. They had absolutely no idea that I had enough liquid capital in my personal accounts to buy the entire hospital outright if I wanted to. They had critically underestimated their enemy, and now it was time for them to pay the price for their blinding arrogance. I pulled out my encrypted smartphone and dialed Jackson on the secured line. He answered immediately. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him it was time to execute Phase 2 of our operation. I ordered him to aggressively target every single piece of bad debt Preston was carrying. Preston lived a lavish lifestyle built entirely on a mountain of high-interest loans and leveraged assets. He owed millions to private lenders and shadowy offshore entities to fund his money laundering operations. I instructed Jackson to use our network of anonymous shell corporations to silently buy up every single one of those debts. I wanted my company to become Preston's largest and most unforgiving creditor. Jackson confirmed the order, his fingers already clacking rapidly against his keyboard in the background. I did not stop there. My father had spent the morning trying to publicly humiliate me and legally erase my existence from his empire by disinheriting me for exactly $1. It was a petty and arrogant move. It was time to show Vernon what true corporate warfare looked like. My father's real estate development company was heavily leveraged, holding massive commercial loans on properties all across Maryland. He relied on a complex web of financing to maintain his status as a billionaire real estate tycoon. I told Jackson to deploy our excess capital and aggressively purchase the primary commercial mortgages on my father's flagship properties. I wanted to control the financial lifeblood of his entire empire. I wanted to legally own the very ground he walked on. Jackson whistled softly over the encrypted line, impressed by the sheer scale of the financial assault. He warned me that buying up that much high-profile corporate debt through shell companies would take significant resources and precise timing to avoid triggering regulatory alarms. I told him we had unlimited resources, and I wanted the acquisitions completed by the end of the business week. I wanted to build a financial noose around my family's collective neck, and I wanted it tight before they even realized they were suffocating. As I spoke, the hospital elevator doors chimed and slid open. I watched a group of exhausted nurses step out carrying fresh linens. I lowered my voice, ensuring absolute privacy. I told Jackson that I did not just want to ruin them financially. I wanted to legally and systematically dismantle their entire operation from the inside out. I instructed him to compile a massive, highly detailed financial dossier, tracking every single illicit transaction Preston had made using my father's company. I wanted every forged document, every offshore wire transfer, and every piece of deleted security camera footage cross-referenced and neatly organized. Jackson assured me his team was already building the master file. He said Preston's digital footprint was incredibly sloppy, making the evidence-gathering process almost too easy. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I walked slowly toward my son's hospital room, stopping right outside the heavy glass door. I watched his small chest rise and fall with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. My anger had completely transformed into a cold, calculated precision. The emotional wounds my family had inflicted on me over the years were finally healing, replaced by a fierce and protective tactical resolve. They had forced me into the shadows, treating me like an outcast and a scapegoat. But they forgot that the shadows are exactly where a military intelligence officer operates best. I was no longer the vulnerable daughter seeking their conditional love. I was the architect of their total destruction, and they had no idea the storm they had unleashed was about to wipe their perfectly manicured world right off the map. I stood outside the heavy glass door of my son's intensive care unit room, watching the steady rise and fall of his small chest. The hospital was quiet, but my mind was operating at maximum velocity. My tactical tablet vibrated against my side. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. Jackson had just uploaded the master financial file tracking Preston's entire money laundering syndicate. I opened the encrypted application and began scrolling through the thousands of pages of digital evidence. There were offshore wire transfers, shell corporation deeds, and falsified tax returns. Preston had left a massive digital footprint that proved his absolute guilt. But as I dug deeper into the hidden architecture of his offshore accounts, I noticed a strange anomaly. There was a highly secure trust fund established just 3 weeks ago in the Cayman Islands. It was separated from the main syndicate accounts and heavily encrypted. I tapped the screen and initiated a forced decryption protocol, bypassing the bank security firewalls. I needed to see exactly who held the keys to this specific dark account. When the documents finally rendered on my screen, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. The primary beneficiary and legal shield for this massive illegal trust fund was not Preston. It was not Monique. The name printed boldly on the offshore registration documents was Leo. Preston had used my 7-year-old son's full legal name and his highly sensitive social security number to open a shadow account for an international organized crime syndicate. My hands gripped the edges of the tablet so tightly the metal casing began to creak. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the establishment forms. There was a perfectly forged version of my own signature authorizing the creation of the trust. Preston and Monique had orchestrated this entire scheme. They deliberately set up a chronically ill child to be the ultimate fall guy for their federal crimes. Preston knew the authorities would eventually start tracking his dirty money. He needed a failsafe to protect himself from a lengthy prison sentence. He planned to route the most dangerous illicit funds directly into an account under my son's name. If the federal government ever raided my father's real estate company, Preston would simply point the finger at me. He would claim that I used my military intelligence background and my son's identity to run a massive financial fraud right under their noses. The sheer depravity of his plan took my breath away. He did not just lock my boy outside in a Category 4 hurricane to cover up a simple forgery. He was actively trying to eliminate the only physical link to his federal crimes. If Leo died in the storm, Preston could easily claim the offshore trust was just a tragic financial mistake made by a grieving, unstable mother. He would keep the stolen millions, and I would be left completely destroyed. He viewed my son as nothing more than a disposable human shield. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath to contain the overwhelming rage threatening to break my concentration. Emotion is the enemy of strategy, and I needed to remain perfectly clinical. I opened a secure communication channel directly to a highly classified contact within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His name was Agent Harris, and he worked as a senior director in the Financial Crimes Division. We had collaborated on several international security operations in the past. He knew my reputation, and he knew I never reached out unless the threat was absolute. I drafted a highly encrypted message detailing the exact nature of Preston's money laundering syndicate. I did not include any personal family drama or emotional pleas. I presented the facts with cold military precision. I attached the complete digital dossier Jackson had compiled. I included the uncompressed high-definition video files showing Preston and Monique forging my father's signature in the study. I provided the Cayman Island routing numbers, the Shell Corporation ledgers, and the dark trust fund documents proving identity theft against a minor. I also included the direct link between Preston's shadow accounts and the known organized crime syndicate he was servicing. I added a final note explaining that Preston was currently acting as a senior executive within my father's massive real estate development company. I warned the Federal Bureau of Investigation that Preston was actively transferring millions of dollars of legitimate assets into criminal hands. I hit send and watched the progress bar quickly fill the screen. The encrypted payload vanished into the federal database. There was no undoing this action. The federal gears were now officially in motion. Agent Harris responded less than 60 seconds later. His message was incredibly brief. He confirmed receipt of the dossier and stated that a federal strike team was being assembled. He told me to maintain my distance and allow the authorities to execute their operation. I locked my tablet and slid it back into my jacket pocket. I had just handed the federal government the exact blueprint to completely dismantle my family's false empire. Preston thought he was a mastermind playing a brilliant game of corporate chess. He thought his white privilege and his stolen wealth made him invincible against the law and against me. He had no idea that federal warrants were already being drafted with his name on them. He had no idea that his entire life was about to be reduced to a prison number. I turned my attention back to the glass window, looking at my son. The heavy weight that had been pressing on my chest since the hospital called finally began to lift. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to spring it. I promised Leo that the men who hurt him would never see the light of day again. I stood guard outside his door, ready for the final battle to begin. I pushed open the heavy glass door to my son's hospital room and stepped quietly inside. The air was cold and smelled of strong clinical antiseptic. The rhythmic whoosh of the mechanical ventilator had been the only sound tethering me to reality for the past 24 hours. But as I walked closer to the bed, I noticed a change. The respiratory therapist was standing near the monitor, adjusting the dials. She looked at me with a soft, reassuring smile and told me that Leo's oxygen levels had stabilized significantly. She said his small lungs were finally fighting back against the severe inflammation caused by the freezing storm. The medical team had successfully removed the invasive breathing tube just a few minutes ago, replacing it with a simple oxygen mask. I walked over to the side of the bed and gently placed my hand over his small, fragile fingers. His skin was finally regaining its natural warm brown color instead of the terrifying pale gray I had seen in the emergency room. I stood there in the quiet hospital room, simply watching him breathe on his own. After a few long minutes, his long eyelashes began to flutter. His dark eyes slowly opened, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. He turned his head slightly and looked at me. A weak and sleepy smile spread across his face beneath the plastic oxygen mask. He squeezed my fingers weakly. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, telling him how incredibly brave he was and how much I loved him. I kept my voice perfectly steady, making sure he did not hear the violent rage that was still simmering just beneath my surface. Leo pulled the plastic mask down slightly away from his mouth. His voice was incredibly raspy and barely above a faint whisper. He told me he was sorry for causing so much trouble. My heart shattered into a million pieces hearing my innocent child apologize for being the victim of a brutal assault. I gently stroked his hair and assured him he did absolutely nothing wrong. I told him he was safe now and no one would ever hurt him again. Leo looked away from me and stared blankly at the white hospital ceiling. He swallowed hard and his small body trembled slightly under the thin cotton blankets. He told me he needed to tell me a secret about Uncle Preston. I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, leaning in close so he would not have to strain his damaged vocal cords. I told him he could tell me anything and I would always believe him. Leo took a slow, shallow breath. He explained how he had woken up during the hurricane because the thunder scared him. He said he went downstairs looking for his grandfather Vernon because he thought Vernon would protect him. He wandered into the private study and saw Preston and Monique writing on stacks of paper. Leo said when he walked into the room, Preston grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him violently. The terror in my son's eyes was undeniable as he recalled the memory. Leo whispered that Preston leaned down right into his face and said terrible things. Preston told my 7-year-old boy that I was never coming back from my work trip. He told Leo that nobody in the family loved him because he was a weak and sickly burden. Preston said if Leo ever told anyone about the papers on the desk, he would call the police and have Leo locked away in a dark prison cell forever. Leo started to cry softly, the tears rolling down his cheeks. He said Trey pushed him out the glass door, and Preston just stood there laughing as the heavy deadbolt clicked shut. Preston watched him pound on the glass in the freezing rain and simply turned his back. The sheer malice required to psychologically torture a terrified child before leaving him to die in a hurricane was beyond human comprehension. Preston had intentionally tried to destroy my son's mind before trying to destroy his body. I wiped the tears from Leo's face with my thumb. I leaned down until I was at his eye level. I looked directly into his beautiful brown eyes and spoke with absolute unbreakable conviction. I told him he was the most important person in the entire world to me. I promised him that Preston was a liar and a coward. I held his small face in my hands and made a solemn vow. I said Mommy is going to take everything back. I told him the bad men were going to lose everything they ever cared about and they would never be able to hurt another person again. Leo looked at me and nodded slowly, taking comfort in the absolute certainty of my voice. The pediatric nurse walked into the room to administer a mild sedative to help him rest. I stayed by his side holding his hand until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted back into a deep, peaceful sleep. I knew he was finally safe. I pulled out my phone and contacted my private security firm. I ordered 2 heavily armed tactical operatives to stand guard outside Leo's hospital room door 24 hours a day. I gave them strict orders that absolutely no one from my family was allowed anywhere near the intensive care unit. I left the hospital and drove straight to my secure private residence on the outskirts of the city. It was a minimalist fortress completely hidden from the public record and entirely disconnected from my father's real estate empire. I bypassed the biometric security scanners and walked directly into my command center. The digital clocks on the wall displayed the current time. It was late afternoon. The family empire's grand 40th anniversary gala was scheduled to begin in exactly 4 hours. My father, Vernon, had spent millions of dollars organizing the most lavish corporate event of the decade. The gala was being held in the grand ballroom of his flagship luxury hotel downtown. Hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and corporate executives were expected to attend. Vernon intended to use the anniversary celebration to formally announce Preston as the new chief executive officer of the entire real estate conglomerate. It was supposed to be Preston's crowning moment of ultimate victory and social domination. It was going to be his public execution instead. I walked into my armory and dressing room. I did not choose a traditional evening gown. I selected a custom-tailored midnight black tactical suit. It was designed from advanced ballistic materials, but cut to look like high-end designer formal wear. It allowed for maximum mobility and projected an aura of absolute lethal authority. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe style and fastened my government credential badge to my inner lapel. I checked my encrypted communication earpiece and secured it in place. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me was no longer the discarded daughter desperately seeking her father's approval. She was a weapon forged in the fires of military combat and sharpened by the ultimate betrayal of her own blood. I opened the secure channel to Jackson. He confirmed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation strike team was fully briefed and staging 3 blocks away from the luxury hotel. Jackson also confirmed he had successfully hacked into the hotel's central audiovisual network and locked out their internal security teams. I reviewed the final tactical strategy with Jackson over the secure line. I would enter the grand ballroom exactly when Vernon called Preston to the stage. Jackson would kill the ballroom lights and hijack the massive projector screens. I would display every single piece of damning financial evidence right in front of their wealthy peers. We would trap them in a public spectacle of their own making and let the federal agents drop the final hammer. I picked up my encrypted tablet and the thick manila folder containing the corporate buyout documents. I walked out of the secure residence and climbed into the back of a black armored transport vehicle waiting in my driveway. The engine roared to life with a deep mechanical growl. The sky outside was turning a dark bruised purple as the sun began to set over Maryland. The calm before the storm was officially over. I told my driver to head to the downtown luxury hotel. I was ready to crash the party and burn their empire to the ground. The heavy armored transport vehicle pulled smoothly up to the front entrance of the downtown luxury hotel. The towering glass facade reflected the vibrant city lights, but I remained hidden behind the pitch-black tinted windows. The front driveway was lined with expensive imported sports cars and luxury sedans. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed back and forth, opening doors for the wealthiest politicians and real estate developers in the state. I adjusted the communication earpiece hidden beneath my hair and pressed 2 fingers to my ear. I asked Jackson for a final status update on the building's security grid. His voice came through perfectly clear. He confirmed that the primary camera loop was locked and the hotel security monitoring room was completely blind. I stepped out of the vehicle and the warm evening air hit my face. My midnight black tactical suit stood out starkly against the sea of brightly colored evening gowns and traditional tuxedos moving toward the main entrance. Two large men wearing cheap, oversized suits stood near the revolving doors. They were my father's personal security guards stationed there to keep unwanted press and uninvited guests away from the grand anniversary gala. They spotted me immediately and crossed their arms, stepping forward to block my path. They clearly recognized me as the disgraced daughter who had been explicitly banned from the family estate. One of them reached for his radio to alert my father. He never even got the chance to press the broadcast button. Two of my elite operatives materialized from the shadows behind the large concrete pillars. They moved with absolute terrifying silence. In less than 2 seconds, the operatives executed a flawless submission hold. They clamped their hands over the guards' mouths and dragged them backward into a dark alcove out of public view. There was no struggle and no sound. The entire takedown was completely bloodless and surgically precise. Jackson whispered in my ear that the perimeter was officially secure and the lobby was mine. I walked through the revolving glass doors and entered the massive grand lobby. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh floral arrangements. I moved gracefully past the front desk, completely ignoring the bewildered looks of the hotel concierge staff. My boots made no sound on the thick plush carpeting. I headed straight for the grand ballroom located at the end of the long gilded hallway. 4 more of my father's private security men were stationed outside the heavy mahogany double doors leading into the event space. As I approached them, I did not break my stride. My tactical operatives dropped silently from the maintenance access panels in the ceiling above the hallway. They neutralized the 4 guards with synchronized stun batons, dropping them to the floor before they could even draw their weapons. My men dragged the unconscious bodies into a nearby service elevator, ensuring the hallway was completely clear. I stood alone before the massive mahogany doors of the grand ballroom. I could hear the muffled sound of a classical string quartet playing inside. I pushed the heavy doors open and slipped into the back of the room, allowing the shadows to conceal my presence. The ballroom was absolutely breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the hundreds of seated guests. The tables were covered in white silk linens and adorned with towering centerpieces of white roses. Waiters in pristine uniforms silently poured expensive champagne into crystal flutes. It was a perfect display of black excellence and generational wealth. But beneath the beautiful surface, it was a kingdom built entirely on fraud and deceit. At the far end of the room stood a massive elevated stage draped in heavy velvet curtains. My father, Vernon, was standing behind a clear acrylic podium, looking incredibly powerful and commanding. The bright spotlights illuminated his tailored tuxedo and his perfectly groomed hair. He was in his element, basking in the adoration of his wealthy peers. Seated at the table of honor directly below the stage were Monique and Preston. Monique wore a glittering designer gown that cost more than most people made in a year. She smiled widely for the event photographers, completely unbothered by the fact that she had tried to murder her own nephew just 24 hours ago. Preston sat next to her, looking incredibly smug and self-satisfied. He adjusted his silk bow tie and took a sip of champagne, fully believing he had successfully stolen my father's entire empire. The string quartet stopped playing and the room fell into a respectful silence. Vernon tapped the microphone and cleared his throat. His deep, booming voice echoed through the massive ballroom speakers. He thanked everyone for attending the 40th anniversary of his real estate conglomerate. He spoke passionately about the importance of family legacy and the hard work required to build an empire from the ground up. He lied with absolute perfection. He painted himself as a devoted patriarch who sacrificed everything to secure a future for his children. The audience hung on to his every word, completely unaware of the monstrous reality behind closed doors. Vernon paused for dramatic effect and looked down lovingly at Preston. He announced that building an empire was only half the battle, and passing it on to the right leader was the true test of a legacy. He called Preston a brilliant visionary and a man of uncompromising integrity. He officially invited Preston to join him on the stage to accept the title of Chief Executive Officer. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Preston stood up, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and plastered a fake, humble smile across his face. He turned and waved to the cheering audience, soaking in the unearned glory. I stepped out of the shadows at the back of the room and walked directly into the center aisle. I did not run, and I did not shout. I walked with the slow, measured cadence of an apex predator closing in on its prey. The guests seated at the back tables noticed me first. The applause nearest to me began to die down as people turned around in their chairs to stare at the woman dressed in tactical combat gear at a black tie gala. The silence rippled forward through the massive room like a wave until the entire ballroom was completely quiet. Preston stopped halfway up the stage stairs. He turned his head, following the gaze of the audience. When his eyes locked onto me standing in the middle of the center aisle, his fake smile instantly vanished. Vernon squinted through the bright stage lights, trying to see what was causing the disruption. When he finally recognized my face, his hands gripped the edges of the acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The ultimate confrontation had officially begun. I did not stop walking until I reached the very edge of the elevated stage. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. Hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state were staring at me, holding their collective breath. Vernon leaned into the microphone on the clear acrylic podium. His voice trembled with a mixture of absolute fury and deep embarrassment. He ordered the hotel security to immediately remove me from the premises. He loudly declared that I was an estranged and mentally unstable family member trying to ruin a private corporate event. I simply looked up at him and offered a cold, humorless smile. I reached up and tapped the hidden communication earpiece tucked behind my ear. I whispered a single word, instructing Jackson to initiate the blackout protocol. Instantly, every single crystal chandelier in the massive grand ballroom went completely dark. The sudden plunge into pitch-black darkness was followed by a chorus of startled gasps and confused murmurs from the elite audience. The string quartet dropped their instruments with loud clattering sounds. Preston scrambled backward on the stage stairs, tripping over his expensive leather shoes in the dark. A few seconds later, the massive digital projector screens mounted directly behind the stage flared to brilliant, blinding life. The sudden bright light cast long, sharp shadows across Vernon's terrified face. The screens did not display the golden 40th anniversary logo of my father's real estate empire. Instead, they showed a stark white digital waveform of an audio file set against a pitch-black background. I raised my right hand, holding a small tactical microphone that Jackson had successfully integrated into the hotel's primary public address system. My voice boomed through the massive concert speakers, easily drowning out the panicked whispers of the crowd. I welcomed the distinguished guests to the real anniversary celebration. I told them they had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to Vernon talk about legacy and unyielding integrity. I said it was only fair they heard from the man Vernon just blindly named as the new chief executive officer of the empire. I told the audience that Preston had his own unique views on the family business and his own special way of describing the man who gave him everything. I gave Jackson the verbal command to hit play on the master audio file. The digital waveform on the massive screens began to violently jump and spike. The crystal-clear high-definition audio of Preston's voice echoed through the grand ballroom. It was a recorded phone call between Preston and one of his offshore criminal associates. The audience immediately recognized his distinct, arrogant tone. In the recording, Preston was laughing loudly, clinking a glass of ice against the receiver. He boasted to his associate about how incredibly easy it was to siphon millions of dollars directly out of the corporate accounts. His associate asked him if Vernon would ever catch on to the massive financial discrepancies. Preston's recorded voice echoed off the gilded walls of the ballroom. He laughed a cruel and dismissive sound. He told his associate not to worry about Vernon at all. Preston proudly declared that Vernon was just a stupid old black man who was so desperate for white corporate validation that he practically handed him the keys to the entire vault. He said Vernon would sign any document placed in front of him as long as it made him look wealthy and important to his country club friends. A collective gasp of absolute horror and disgust ripped through the audience. The wealthy black politicians and elite business owners sitting at the front tables physically recoiled in their seats. The sheer racism and predatory malice in Preston's voice shattered the carefully constructed illusion of their perfect family dynamic. But the recording was not finished. Preston continued bragging on the audio track. He detailed exactly how he and Monique were forging Vernon's signatures on highly sensitive real estate deeds. He explained the complex network of offshore shell companies he created in the Cayman Islands to wash dirty money for a known international crime syndicate. Then came the final devastating blow. The audio played the exact moment Preston explained his ultimate fail-safe plan. He told his criminal associate that if the federal authorities ever started investigating the missing funds, he had already set up a shadow trust account to take the fall. He proudly admitted that he used the legal name and social security number of his chronically ill 7-year-old nephew Leo to register the illegal offshore accounts. He laughed and said the authorities would spend years chasing a sick child and a traumatized veteran mother while he walked away completely clean with the stolen millions. The audio file ended abruptly, leaving the digital waveform flat and silent on the massive screens. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. It was a heavy, thick quiet born from absolute shock and sheer revulsion. Vernon stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. His shoulders slumped, and his chest heaved as he struggled to process the devastating humiliation. The man who cared more about his public image than his own flesh and blood had just been globally exposed as a gullible fool and a victim of massive fraud. The racist insult echoed in his mind, completely destroying the unearned pride he held for his white son-in-law. Preston scrambled down the remaining stage stairs in a blind panic. His face was pale and drenched in cold sweat. He waved his arms frantically at the completely empty audio-visual control booth located at the back of the room. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that someone turn the screens off immediately. He desperately yelled that the audio recording was a deep fake generated by artificial intelligence. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told the disgusted crowd that I was a cyber terrorist trying to extort him. But absolutely no one in the room believed a single word coming out of his mouth. The wealthy guest looked at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. Monique sat frozen at the table of honor, staring up at the blank projector screens with her mouth hanging wide open. Her perfect designer world had just violently evaporated into thin air. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stage steps, absorbing the total collapse of their empire. I looked Preston dead in the eye and lowered my microphone. The evidence was irrefutable, and the trap was now completely sprung. All that was left was for the authorities to clean up the garbage. The heavy silence in the ballroom was suddenly shattered by the sharp sound of wood scraping against polished marble. Monique violently pushed her chair back from the table of honor and jumped to her feet. The chair toppled over, crashing loudly onto the floor, but she did not even look back at it. Her carefully manicured facade had completely melted away, leaving behind a manic and desperate woman. She pointed a trembling finger up at the blank digital projector screens, and then pointed directly at me. Her voice echoed through the massive room, shrill and bordering on pure hysteria. She screamed to the wealthy audience that the audio recording was a complete fabrication. She desperately claimed that I was using highly advanced military artificial intelligence to create a deep fake of her husband's voice. She looked around at the hundreds of faces staring back at her, trying to lock eyes with the socialites and politicians she usually charmed. She cried out that I was a deeply disturbed and jealous sister, trying to ruin her perfect family because my own life was a miserable failure. She begged the crowd not to believe a single word of the digital recording, painting herself as the ultimate victim of a cruel cyber attack. But the elite guests simply stared at her with cold, unblinking judgment. Nobody was buying her frantic lies. The sheer, authentic malice in Preston's voice on that recording was impossible to replicate. Preston realized that his wife's attempt at public gaslighting was failing miserably. He decided to pivot back to the only weapon he knew how to wield against people he viewed as beneath him. He puffed out his chest and marched down the center aisle toward me. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a safe distance from my tactical operatives, who were standing quietly in the shadows. His face was flushed red with anger and humiliation. He pointed a finger at my face and told me I had just committed professional suicide. He spoke in a loud, booming voice, ensuring the entire ballroom could hear his threats. He promised to sue me for everything I owned. He threatened to file charges for gross defamation, corporate espionage, and severe emotional distress. He told the crowd that his team of high-priced corporate lawyers would drag me through federal court until I was completely bankrupt and locked in a prison cell for the rest of my life. I did not flinch or take a step back. I looked at Preston as if he were an annoying insect buzzing around my head. I let him exhaust his empty legal threats, watching him dig his own grave deeper with every word. While Preston and Monique put on their desperate theatrical performance, my father Vernon was completely silent on the stage. Vernon was a ruthless and paranoid businessman who had survived in the cutthroat real estate market for 4 decades. He did not care about Monique's tears or Preston's legal blustering. The horrific racist insult on the audio tape had shattered his blind loyalty. Vernon stepped out from behind the clear acrylic podium, ignoring his daughter and son-in-law entirely. He looked out into the crowd and loudly called the name of his chief financial officer, who was sitting at a nearby VIP table. Vernon barked an absolute order, demanding that the chief financial officer open the corporate accounting portals immediately. He wanted visual confirmation that the primary development accounts and offshore holdings were secure. The chief financial officer was a balding man who was already sweating profusely. He fumbled with his expensive briefcase and pulled out a highly encrypted corporate laptop. He set it on the table, surrounded by silent guests, and quickly connected to the secure hotel network. The entire ballroom watched in tense anticipation as the man typed his administrative credentials into the banking portal. Vernon paced the edge of the stage, demanding to know the exact liquid balance. The chief financial officer stared at his laptop screen. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He typed his password again, and then a third time. He looked up at Vernon, and his face was completely drained of blood. He stammered into the quiet room, telling Vernon that the system was rejecting his global access codes. He said the 2-factor authentication protocols had been entirely overwritten. He told my father in a voice filled with sheer terror that he was completely locked out of the master ledgers. Vernon refused to accept the reality of the situation. He reached into his tuxedo jacket pocket and pulled out his own encrypted smartphone. He furiously tapped the screen, trying to bypass the corporate network and access his personal executive banking applications. He tried his private wealth management accounts, his trust fund portals, and even his standard black credit cards. Every single screen flashed the same stark red message indicating that access was permanently denied due to an external administrative freeze. Vernon lowered his phone slowly. He looked over at Preston with a chilling realization dawning in his eyes. He finally understood that the money was actually gone. Preston saw the look on my father's face and started to panic. He desperately tried to convince Vernon that the lockout was just a temporary network glitch caused by my cyber attack. He swore that the funds were perfectly safe and told Vernon not to listen to my elaborate lies. But Vernon knew the difference between a temporary server error and a total financial hostile takeover. The foundation of his massive empire was crumbling directly beneath his feet. I stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. I projected my voice so every single person in the grand ballroom could hear me perfectly. I addressed my father directly, looking up at him on the stage. I told him his chief financial officer could not access the ledgers because those corporate accounts no longer belonged to his company. I explained that while he was busy sending a lawyer to the hospital to disinherit me for exactly $1, I was busy deploying my private security firm to legally acquire all of his commercial debt. I told the crowd that my anonymous shell corporations had spent the entire day buying up every single high-interest loan and compromised mortgage his empire was built upon. I told Vernon that standard corporate foreclosure protocols allowed the primary creditor to instantly freeze all liquid assets the moment a massive federal fraud was detected within the debtor organization. I looked at Preston and Monique, watching the absolute despair wash over their faces. I informed my father that his bank accounts, his trust funds, and his corporate credit lines were now entirely under my direct control. I told him he could not even buy a cup of coffee or pay Preston's expensive lawyers without asking for my personal authorization first. The psychological collapse was immediate and devastating. Vernon clutched his chest, stumbling backward against the acrylic podium for physical support. The proud and arrogant patriarch had been reduced to an absolute prisoner in his own kingdom. Monique sank down onto the floor beside her overturned chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her sudden poverty set in. Preston stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The wealthy audience began to aggressively whisper among themselves, and several prominent politicians immediately stood up to leave the tainted room to protect their own reputations. The gaslighting had failed, and the ultimate downfall of their toxic empire was now irreversible. The sheer magnitude of the total financial freeze hit the room like a physical shockwave. While Vernon stood paralyzed behind the podium, staring at his useless phone, Preston realized the trap was completely inescapable. The massive projector screens above them were still glowing stark white, illuminating the sheer panic on his face. He knew that if I had the power to seize the corporate accounts, I had also handed the offshore money laundering evidence over to the federal authorities. Preston slowly took a step backward toward the heavy velvet curtains draped across the back of the stage. He thought the hundreds of shocked guests and my father's public breakdown would provide enough of a distraction for him to simply vanish into the night. He turned his back on his weeping wife and the ruined patriarch and quietly slipped behind the dark red fabric, heading straight for the concealed service exit. He was a coward who always ran when his privilege could no longer protect him. But I had already anticipated his cowardice. I stood at the bottom of the stage steps and watched the heavy velvet curtain ripple where he had disappeared. I did not move to chase him. I simply waited. Just as Preston's hand touched the brass handle of the back exit door, a deafening crash echoed through the massive ballroom. The heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance were violently kicked open. The remaining hotel security guards were shoved forcefully aside. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests flooded into the room. The letters FBI were emblazoned in bright yellow across their backs. The panicked murmurs of the wealthy audience instantly transformed into genuine screams of terror. Guests scrambled out of their chairs, knocking over crystal champagne flutes and towering floral centerpieces in a desperate attempt to get out of the way. Agent Harris walked right through the center of the chaos. He did not run. He moved with the calm, commanding authority of a senior federal director executing a massive sting operation. He held a thick stack of federal warrants in his hand. He marched straight down the center aisle toward the elevated stage, his eyes scanning the room. He gave me a brief, imperceptible nod as he passed by me. Behind the heavy velvet curtains on the stage, a loud scuffle broke out. There was the sound of a body slamming hard against the wooden floorboards, followed by a sharp command to stop resisting. A moment later, two massive federal tactical agents emerged from behind the curtain, dragging Preston by his expensive tuxedo jacket. Preston's slicked-back hair was completely disheveled, and his face was twisted in a mask of absolute terror. The agents hauled him to the dead center of the brightly lit stage, right next to the clear acrylic podium where he was supposed to be crowned chief executive officer. They forced him to his knees on the hard floor. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the microphone that was still active on the podium. Agent Harris stepped onto the stage and looked down at Preston with absolute disgust. He loudly read Preston his rights, announcing that he was being placed under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy to commit identity theft against a minor. Preston sobbed openly, the tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly manicured image. He begged the agents to listen to him, claiming he was framed and that he had powerful friends who could fix this. Agent Harris simply ignored him and signaled for the tactical team to haul him away. Monique watched her husband being dragged off the stage in federal chains. The reality of the situation finally broke through her walls of delusion. She realized the federal agents were not just here for Preston. They were here for the forged documents she had personally signed. The lavish lifestyle she had built on the backs of stolen money and cruelty was completely over. Her legs gave out beneath her and she collapsed entirely onto the polished marble floor of the ballroom. She curled into a tight ball, hyperventilating and shaking violently. The elite society friends she had spent years trying to impress stepped over her as they rushed toward the exits, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of our family empire. Vernon stood perfectly still amidst the total destruction of his life. He watched the federal agents fan out across the ballroom, securing the exits and confiscating the corporate laptops from the finance tables. His legacy was dead. His reputation was permanently destroyed. His golden son-in-law was a federal criminal, and his favorite daughter was a complicit felon crying on the floor. Vernon slowly turned his head and looked down at me standing calmly at the base of the stage. The arrogant patriarch who had disinherited me for exactly $1 just hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man who had suddenly realized he had bet on the wrong child. Vernon stumbled down the stage steps, his hands reaching out toward me in a desperate plea. He stopped just a few feet away from me, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked at my tactical suit and the federal credential badge pinned to my lapel. He finally understood the true extent of my power and the massive network of resources I controlled. He swallowed his pride and begged me for help. His voice was cracked and weak. He pleaded with me to talk to Agent Harris and use my government clearance to call off the raid. He promised me everything he had left. He frantically offered to rewrite his will and make me the sole heir to the empire. He told me he would name me the chief executive officer right now if I just fixed this catastrophic mess and saved his company from total federal seizure. I looked at the man who had authorized throwing my 7-year-old son into a freezing hurricane to protect a thief. I looked at the man who cared more about his public image than the life of his own grandson. He was offering me the very kingdom I had just burned to the ground. I kept my face completely emotionless and my posture perfectly straight. I let his desperate pleas hang in the cold air of the ruined ballroom, allowing the absolute finality of his failure to sink deep into his bones. I looked down at the broken man begging at my feet. Vernon was desperately offering me the very company I had already taken from him. He was trying to use the same manipulative tactics he had used my entire life. He thought he could buy my loyalty and my forgiveness with a meaningless corporate title. He truly believed that if he just offered me enough money, I would forget that he had locked my asthmatic 7-year-old son outside in a Category 4 hurricane. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely blank. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. I told my father that his sudden generosity was completely unnecessary. I told him he did not have the power to make me the chief executive officer of his real estate empire because he no longer had an empire to give away. Vernon stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. His breathing was shallow and erratic. I turned away from him and walked over to the table of honor where Monique was still weeping on the floor. I gestured to one of my tactical operatives waiting in the shadows near the ballroom entrance. The operative stepped forward carrying a heavy black aluminum briefcase. He placed it gently onto the center of the table right next to the overturned crystal champagne flutes and the scattered white roses. The metallic click of the briefcase latches opening sounded like a gunshot in the massive quiet room. The few remaining guests and hotel staff watched in absolute stunned silence. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. I dropped the massive stack directly onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed across the grand ballroom. I looked back at Vernon, who was slowly pulling himself up, using the edge of the clear acrylic podium for support. I projected my voice clearly so that every single word would permanently brand itself into his memory. I told my father that those documents were the final executed contracts of a massive corporate acquisition. I explained that my private security firm had not just frozen his corporate accounts as a temporary security measure. I told him we had officially executed a hostile takeover of his entire life. I explained the legal mechanics of his absolute ruin. When my network of anonymous shell corporations bought up all of his commercial debt and Preston's high-interest loans, we became the primary lien holder for his entire conglomerate. Because Preston had committed massive federal wire fraud using the corporate accounts, it immediately triggered the catastrophic default clauses hidden deep within those original commercial mortgage contracts. I told Vernon that standard corporate law dictated that upon severe federal default, the primary creditor has the absolute right to seize all collateral immediately without a lengthy court battle. I pointed to the thick stack of papers on the table. I told him the collateral for those massive loans was everything he owned. Vernon's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He shook his head in slow disbelief, mumbling that it was impossible. I told him it was not just the commercial real estate development company that was gone. I told him I had seized the downtown luxury hotel we were currently standing in. I told him I had seized his private wealth management portfolios and his offshore investment accounts. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. I took a slow step closer to the stage and looked directly into his eyes. I told my father that the corporate loans were also cross-collateralized against his personal assets. I told him that my private security firm was now the sole legal owner of the massive Maryland family estate. I legally owned the sprawling brick colonial mansion, the manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool, and the very roof over his head. He had nothing left. The man who had spent 4 decades building an untouchable kingdom of black excellence and generational wealth was now completely homeless and entirely bankrupt. He was a billionaire reduced to absolute zero in less than 24 hours. The sheer magnitude of his loss finally crushed the last remaining ounces of his arrogant pride. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold acrylic podium, completely unable to speak or defend himself. I reached into the inner pocket of my midnight black tactical jacket. My fingers brushed against a small crisp piece of paper I had been saving for this exact moment. I pulled it out and walked slowly up the stage steps. I stopped right next to my father. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes red and brimming with tears of total defeat. I held up my right hand and opened my fingers. Between my index and middle finger was a single crisp $1 bill. I reminded my father about the smug corporate lawyer he had sent to the pediatric intensive care unit that morning. I reminded him how he had tried to publicly humiliate me and legally erase my existence by disinheriting me while my son was fighting for his life on a ventilator. He wanted to leave me exactly $1 to prove that he had intentionally cut me out of his prestigious family legacy. I looked into his terrified, broken eyes and saw the exact moment his soul completely shattered. I reached out and tucked the crisp $1 bill directly into the breast pocket of his expensive tailored tuxedo jacket. I told him softly that I always pay my debts. I told him that single dollar was exactly what his entire legacy was worth to me. I patted his chest right over his heart, making sure the paper bill was securely tucked away. I told him to keep it safe because it was the only piece of currency he had left to his name. I stepped back and let the absolute silence of the room amplify his total destruction. He looked down at the dollar bill sticking out of his pocket and let out a broken, pathetic sob. He had sacrificed his own grandson to protect a criminal, and in return he had lost everything he ever valued. I turned my back on the ruined patriarch and walked slowly down the stage steps, leaving him alone in the blinding white light of the projector screens. His empire was finally dead, and my son was completely safe. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the grand ballroom and walked out into the cool night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the downtown street. I climbed back into my armored transport vehicle and instructed my driver to head directly to the Maryland family estate. The hostile takeover was legally complete, but I needed to physically secure my new property. I sat in the quiet darkness of the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settling over my mind. The heavy burden of seeking approval from people who despised me was completely gone. I arrived at the massive iron gates of the estate 30 minutes later. My private tactical operatives were already stationed along the perimeter wall. They had seamlessly replaced my father's private security detail. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open automatically as my vehicle approached. I stepped out onto the circular cobblestone driveway and looked up at the sprawling brick colonial mansion. It was the house where I had spent my entire childhood, feeling like a prisoner and an outcast. Now it legally belonged to me, and I was about to perform a thorough cleansing. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors using the administrative master codes Jackson had transferred to my tablet. I walked into the grand foyer and turned on the massive crystal chandelier. The house was completely silent. I instructed my tactical team to secure every exit and stand guard in the main hallways. We did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a cheap yellow taxi pulled up to the front gates. Vernon and Monique had been forced to take a public cab because all of their luxury vehicles were registered under the seized corporate accounts. The tactical guards at the gate allowed them to walk up the long driveway on foot. They looked completely destroyed. Monique's expensive designer gown was torn and stained with dirt from when she collapsed on the ballroom floor. Vernon's tuxedo was disheveled, and he walked with a severe limp, dragging his feet across the cobblestones. They opened the front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me standing at the bottom of the sweeping mahogany staircase. I was flanked by 4 heavily armed operatives dressed in black tactical gear. Vernon looked around his former home with hollow, empty eyes. He finally understood that there was no hidden loophole and no secret escape route. I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the foyer. I told them the current time and stated that they had exactly 1 hour to pack their personal belongings and vacate my property. Monique immediately started to scream. She yelled that I was a monster and a psychopath. She demanded to know where she was supposed to go in the middle of the night with a husband in federal custody and $0 in her bank account. I looked at her with zero sympathy. I told her she could sleep on a park bench or in a homeless shelter for all I cared. I reminded her that just 24 hours ago, she and Preston threw my sick child out into a Category 4 hurricane. I told her she was incredibly lucky I was only taking her house and not her life. I laid out the strict rules of their eviction. I told them they were only allowed to take basic clothing and cheap personal hygiene items. I explicitly forbade them from taking any expensive jewelry, designer handbags, fine art, or electronics. I explained that all luxury assets were legally classified as corporate collateral and belonged to my firm. If they tried to steal a single diamond ring or a luxury watch, I promised to have them immediately arrested for felony grand larceny. I instructed 2 of my guards to escort them to their bedrooms and monitor everything they put into their bags. Vernon did not say a single word. He hung his head and slowly climbed the grand staircase, like a man walking to the execution block. He looked old and incredibly frail. The illusion of his powerful black excellence was completely shattered. Monique, on the other hand, refused to accept reality. She ran up the stairs crying hysterically and stormed into her massive walk-in closet. A few minutes later, I heard the sounds of things crashing to the floor. I walked upstairs and stood in the doorway of her bedroom. Monique was frantically trying to shove expensive designer purses and diamond necklaces into a large leather suitcase. My tactical guard stepped forward and calmly confiscated the suitcase from her trembling hands. He dumped the luxury items onto the floor and handed her a cheap black plastic garbage bag instead. Monique fell to her knees and began to openly sob. She crawled across the carpet and actually tried to grab my heavy tactical boots. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her ruined makeup. She begged me to let her stay. She played the family card desperately, reminding me that we were sisters and that we shared the same blood. She promised to do anything I wanted. She said she would work as my maid or my cook if I just let her live in the guest house. She pleaded that she could not survive in the real world without her money and her status. I stepped back, pulling my boot out of her pathetic grasp. I looked down at her with pure clinical disgust. I told her that sisters do not forge documents, and sisters certainly do not try to murder their own nephews to cover up a federal crime. I told her that she made her choice when she stood by laughing while Preston terrorized my 7-year-old son. I turned my back on her and walked back down the grand staircase, leaving her weeping loudly into the carpet. The hour passed quickly. I stood by the open front doors, watching the heavy rain clouds begin to gather again in the night sky. Vernon walked down the stairs first. He was carrying a single black plastic garbage bag filled with a few basic suits and casual clothes. He did not look at me as he walked out the door and stepped down onto the cobblestone driveway. He was completely defeated. A few moments later, my tactical guards appeared at the top of the stairs, dragging Monique by her arms. She was kicking and screaming, refusing to walk on her own. She yelled obscenities at me, demanding her expensive shoes and her jewelry. The guards dragged her smoothly down the stairs and physically tossed her out the front doors. She landed hard on the wet cobblestones right next to her own plastic garbage bag of cheap clothes. I stood in the massive doorway, looking out at the two people who had tormented me my entire life. They were sitting in the dark, shivering in the cool night air, with absolutely nothing to their names. They had no cars, no money, no respect, and no family. They had finally reaped the exact harvest they had spent decades sowing. I did not offer them a ride. I did not offer them a final word of comfort. I simply grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors and pulled them shut. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place echoed through the grand foyer. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I turned around and looked at my empty, peaceful house. The toxic empire was officially dead, and my real life was finally ready to begin. The morning sun rose over the estate, washing the brick walls in a warm golden light. The dark storm that had hung over my life for decades was finally gone forever. The heavy silence of the house was no longer oppressive, but deeply comforting. In the weeks and months that followed the night of the gala, the federal justice system moved with ruthless and devastating efficiency. Preston tried everything to escape his absolute fate. He was forced to hire cheap public defenders because all of his corporate funds were frozen, and he desperately tried to use his natural manipulative charm to negotiate a lenient plea deal. But Agent Harris and the federal prosecutors offered absolutely no mercy to a man who stole millions and endangered a child. The digital paper trail my intelligence team provided was entirely bulletproof. The offshore bank routing numbers, the forged corporate signatures, and the crystal-clear recorded audio confession painted a picture of undeniable, absolute guilt. Preston stood in a sterile federal courtroom, completely stripped of his tailored designer suits and his arrogant, privileged smirk. He wore a standard orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. The federal judge looked down at him with pure disgust and handed down a severe sentence of 15 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. As the armed bailiffs placed the heavy steel chains around his waist and wrists and led him out of the courtroom, he looked back at the empty wooden benches of the gallery. He had absolutely nobody left to manipulate. He was just another convicted felon walking into a cold concrete cage where his white-collar privilege meant absolutely nothing and his future was entirely erased. Monique faced a daily reality that was perhaps even worse than a quiet prison cell for someone so deeply obsessed with high society status. The federal authorities froze every single personal bank account and aggressively seized all the luxury assets she had hidden away in her closets. Her wealthy elite friends completely abandoned her overnight, refusing to even return a phone call from a convicted criminal's destitute wife. The exclusive country club memberships, the expensive spa days, and the lavish dinner parties were instantly replaced by the harsh, crushing reality of minimum wage survival. She was violently evicted from her temporary hotel room and forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous, forgotten part of the city. To pay her meager rent and afford basic groceries, she had to take a demanding job, working as a waitress at a run-down 24-hour diner right off the interstate highway. The glamorous woman who once wore custom designer gowns and looked down on the working class with extreme prejudice now spent her exhausting days wiping greasy tables and serving cheap, bitter coffee to tired truck drivers. Her soft, perfectly manicured hands became rough, dry, and covered in painful calluses. She had to swallow her massive pride every single day and fake a polite smile for small tips, knowing deep down that she actively traded her family and her soul for a luxurious lifestyle that evaporated into thin air, leaving her completely alone. My father, Vernon, never recovered from the sheer overwhelming shock of his total financial ruin. The immense stress of losing his massive real estate empire, his prestigious reputation, and facing total public humiliation completely destroyed his physical health in a matter of weeks. Just a month after the night of the gala, he suffered a massive and debilitating stroke while sitting alone in a cheap motel room. Because my private security firm had legally seized all of his corporate assets and canceled his premium executive health insurance policies, he was left completely dependent on the overwhelmed state healthcare system. The proud billionaire patriarch who used to command rooms full of powerful politicians became a forgotten ward of the county. He was placed in a bleak, underfunded state nursing home far away from the beautiful, affluent neighborhoods he used to control and develop. The stroke robbed him of his mobility and his ability to speak clearly, leaving him trapped inside his own failing body. He spent his long, lonely days confined to a cheap plastic wheelchair, parked in the corner of a sterile-smelling recreation room, staring blankly at the peeling beige paint on the wall. The nursing staff reported that he absolutely refused to let go of a single crumpled, crisp $1 bill, holding it tightly in his trembling, wrinkled hand every single day. He had finally learned the true devastating cost of his toxic arrogance, and he had the rest of his miserable, silent life to think about the loving family he so carelessly threw away. While their toxic and artificial world crumbled to dust, my world completely blossomed into something beautiful and real. Leo made a full and miraculous recovery from the physical trauma of the hurricane and the psychological abuse he endured. The pediatric doctors were amazed by his physical resilience, and I made sure he had the best trauma counselors to heal his gentle mind. I slowly transformed the sprawling cold estate into a vibrant home, filled with genuine warmth, safety, and endless laughter. We painted the dark, oppressive walls bright, cheerful colors and filled the massive empty rooms with toys, music, and unconditional love. The grand mahogany dining room that used to host tense theatrical Sunday dinners full of lies was now a happy place where my son and I ate messy chocolate chip pancakes and talked excitedly about our future dreams. My security consulting firm continued to expand globally, securing massive federal contracts, but my absolute greatest achievement was giving my child a peaceful life, completely free from fear, judgment, and manipulation. We were finally entirely safe. As I stand on the back patio today watching Leo playing happily and running freely in the sunny green backyard, I realize a profound truth. True family is never automatically defined by shared genetics, bloodlines, or legal obligations. Family is defined purely by the people who consistently choose to protect you, respect your boundaries, and value your inner peace. If someone demands your silence simply to protect their comfortable lies or uses guilt to keep you small, they do not genuinely love you. You have the absolute right to walk away from toxic environments and build a magnificent fortress of your own. Thank you so much for listening to my journey from start to finish. If you have ever had to find the courage to cut toxic people out of your life to protect your own peace, please let me know your story in the comments section below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of survival, resilience, and finding your true worth. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they are strong enough to take their life back today. Remember that your peace of mind is priceless, and your story is entirely yours to write.